Okay, I think we're going to get started. My august colleague was just here telling me that I should be punctual and start even if we expect more people to trickle in. So I think that's what we'll do. I'm Erica Chenoweth. I teach in the Korbel School of International Studies. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and suppose many of you have passed through the university in varying different ways and in different departments in the past, so welcome back. We're really glad you're here. So I thought I'd start by telling you about an argument that I had back in 2006 that pushed me into a whole different research direction than the one I expected to follow during my career. So in June 2006, I was a PhD student at CU Boulder, just up the road. I studied political science, and I was finishing my doctoral dissertation on the topic of why terrorism is so common in democratic countries. I was pretty much trained as a traditional security studies scholar, so everything that I studied either blew up or whizzes through the air at really high velocity and is usually lethal in the end. So I was really troubled when I received an email inviting me to a conference called People, Power, and Pedagogy that was being held at Colorado College. This was a workshop that was trying to encourage social scientists to teach about nonviolence in the classroom. And it was being held at Colorado College and being supported by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which is an educational foundation in Washington, D.C., committed to disseminating knowledge about the theory and practice of nonviolent resistance. So I got this email in my inbox from a friend who also studied terrorism and political violence, and he forwarded it to me and said, "It's down the road for you. It's the other side of the coin. Ha ha ha." And as I read the description of the workshop, I noticed that there were free books and food for those that attended. So that was really the main motivation. And I'm still sort of easily swayed by these types of motivations. And free food, my dad always taught me, is like money in the bank. Anyway, so I applied for this workshop and got in. And they sent me the box of books, and I was familiar with none of them. Even though I was just finishing my PhD in political science, I had never heard of any of the authors that were writing scholarly works about the strategic logic of nonviolent action. And in fact, the authors were people like Gene Sharp, Peter Ackerman, Jack Duvall, a variety of others that are pretty well known in that particular area of scholarship. But we were so siloed in different types of research groups that I'd never come across their work. But I started reading it and was really struck by the audacious claim that they were making that nonviolent resistance, where unarmed civilians actively prosecute conflict against an opponent using a variety of methods like protests, strikes, boycotts, and sequence, they could actually be more effective doing that than armed insurgency. And the reason I was so troubled by this was that I had kind of three major assumptions or reservations. I call them common claims here because I hear them repeated all the time, that led me to think that this was not a very defensible point. So the first was simply that I thought nonviolent resistance couldn't work against highly powerful, authoritarian regimes that were willing to use massive repression against their own people. So in situations like that, we usually associate environments like this with violent insurgency because nonviolence is impossible. The second thing I thought was that nonviolent resistance is more effective probably in places where you're just trying to get a little bit, or you're trying to promote some kind of reform goals, or you're trying to change the laws in a certain way. But if what you're trying to do is really difficult, like overthrowing a dictator, or becoming an independent country through secession, or kicking out a colonial power or foreign military occupation, that nonviolent resistance doesn't work for those super hard things. Those, again, are contexts that we usually associate with violence. And then my third thought was simply the idea that there might be some cases where we can see that nonviolent resistance has worked, but overall, violence is probably still more effective on average than those nonviolent campaigns. And there was a really interesting article that came out in 2006 in the journal International Security by a colleague of mine named Max Abrams. And what Abrams did is he collected all these data on terrorist organizations around the world for the past 40 or so years, and he counted how many of them actually got what they wanted in the end, and found that less than 7% of them actually got what they wanted. And on the last page of his article, he writes, even at 7% effectiveness, probably they were more effective than if they'd used nonviolent protest, which is why we still see terrorism, right? So that was the sort of intellectual environment that I was caught up in when I went to this workshop. So I was the one who, they bring up a case like the Philippines, the People Power Movement in 1986. They bring up the anti-Milosevic movement in 2000 that succeeded, and I would say, well, I can bring up Czechoslovakia 1968, and I can bring up Tiananmen 1989. I can point to as many failures as you can point to successes, just off the top of my head. So toward the end of this workshop, my soon-to-be colleague, Maria Stefan, who at the time was the educational outreach coordinator, kind of approached me and said, if you're so right about all this, why don't you show us? Do some kind of study. How would you do a study that could actually get at this question? And they said, well, first of all, we'd have to move away from picking cases that show that we're right and try to collect systematic data on these phenomena over a very long time period and in very difficult cases. So she said, do it. And the next 2 years, I spent my spare time, collecting data on all known major nonviolent campaigns to remove an incumbent leader, to secede, or to kick out a foreign military or colonial occupation from 1900 to 2006 worldwide. So this involved a lot of kind of digging through historical materials, digging through case studies that have been written by other people about these, and sort of surveying experts on the topic about cases that they knew about that may not make it into traditional media. So at the end of the 2-year process, I had a full list of these nonviolent mass campaigns of those types that were worldwide from 1900 to 2006. And I was easily able to find the violent campaigns that would be analogous to those. They were in the Correlates of War data set. Has anybody heard of Correlates of War data set? Okay, so if you want to know whether there was a war since 1300, you can easily find out by going to the Correlates of War data set. And we have for decades counted these, where they happened, who started it, who ended it, how it ended, how many people died, what it was about. We've got all that, and we've been collecting that for a long time. It's just that nobody had collected stuff that didn't blow up. And so that's where we had to do. So what we did was we then took out all the analogous cases from those violent campaigns. So places where they were just trying to overthrow the incumbent regime, they were trying to get territorial independence. It's important to note this because we're omitting the cases that people might think are places where nonviolent action might have an advantage, like civil rights, economic rights, gender rights, things like that. We're not counting those. We're just counting these so-called maximalist campaigns. And we're just comparing cases where both nonviolent and violent campaigns had at least 1,000 observed participants. So we're not looking at nonviolent campaigns of 3 people. We're only looking at those that have already matured, both for violent and nonviolent campaigns, and comparing those like cases side by side. What did we find out? We found out that actually Maria and that crew were right and I was wrong, which is really kind of sad that I'm the one giving the lecture now, right? It's not very just, but in the end, the nonviolent campaigns from this entire time period were twice as likely to succeed as the violent insurgencies. They were also twice as likely to achieve partial success as their violent counterparts, and violent campaigns were more than twice as likely to fail. This trend has actually been increasing over time, so that in the last 40 years, nonviolent resistance is becoming increasingly effective and frequent, and violent resistance is going out of style in a major way. So despite the news where you see all these pictures of violent insurgents doing stuff in other countries, they end up not really winning in the end. They can make a big mess, but they The probability that they succeed in this decade so far is less than 7%. So basically, this leads us to this huge question. Why has nonviolent resistance succeeded so often, especially given the traditional assumptions that we have about where power comes from? What Maria and I found by drilling down into the data is that the power of nonviolent resistance inheres in the ability of nonviolent campaigns to assemble a mass set of popular support and participation that is often much more diverse and inclusive than what we see among violent insurgencies. This chart shows the predicted probabilities based on our overall modeling of nonviolent campaigns succeeding in the end. And what you can see on the vertical axis is the predicted probability of success. And what you see on the horizontal axis is basically the proportion of the population that's participating. Now, you can't actually directly interpret these raw numbers because it's in a logarithmic scale, but basically what we know is that economists have long speculated that there's what they call the 5% rule. That if a 5% of a population actively starts to contest and mobilize against its government, it can't survive. Because the costs that are imposed on the society are so high through disruption that they can't actually defeat them. Now, the interesting thing is that that was theorized and demonstrated through formal modeling and other things. And we actually find that the percentage is a little lower, that none of the campaigns failed after they achieved a mobilization of 3.5% of their population. And the really big kicker, though, and this is where we actually make a big innovation, is that no popular campaigns reach that threshold of active participation without being nonviolent. So only the nonviolent campaigns were able to amass that many people in the society. So this brings us to a really interesting question. Why is it that nonviolent campaigns, which should be way more dangerous in these types of environments, right, to get out in public and show your face, why is it that they're getting so many more people? Well, we think that there are a few different reasons why nonviolent resistance has lower participation barriers than violent resistance. The first is that there's a lower physical barrier for participation. Now, this simply comes from the observation that doing any type of organized armed activity over any sustained period of time is physically hard. It is difficult. It's no mistake that the vast majority of participants in armed activity are typically athletic young males, because they're the ones who have the physical ability to take on the hazards, the wounds, the injuries, and be resilient over the long term. So what that means is that people who aren't able, for whatever reason, to take certain physical risks over a very extended period of time are excluded from active participation. Now, they may, of course, play support roles and everything. We sometimes see that. But what our data is counting is active participation. So believe it or not, there are lots of nonviolent methods, like the stay-at-home demonstration, that require no physical ability. Other than the ability to sit on your couch for a couple of days. And believe it or not, about 3 million people in a major city sitting on their couch will completely devastate that economy. It will grind it to a halt, and you will have basically a governing group trying to figure out how to make it stop so that they can get their business back rolling. The stay-at-home demonstration and general strike has been one of the most powerful tools of people power campaigns, and it requires almost no physical ability at all. The second lower barrier to participation is the lower commitment barrier. And by this, I don't mean lower commitment to the cause, but instead lower barriers to entry into a campaign and exit from a campaign. So organized armed activity usually requires people to make a totally life-altering choice. That is, they are going to commit offensive violence against somebody else, which puts them in a different category within their societies, into a criminal category that is often punishment through death or terrible types of torture and imprisonment and other things. And that's pretty much universal across societies. So when people join in armed groups, they often have to demonstrate their loyalty to the group by committing a violent act, so that these groups know that they're not informants. So it's hard to get in, and once you get in, it's hard to get out. So these groups tend to kind of stick together over the long haul.